Welcome to Season 4 of the Climate Conscious Podcast. I'm your host, Derval. Today's special guest is a sustainability and social impact consultant based in Toronto and a fierce advocate of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. With extensive experience in international development, nonprofits, and community organizations, she works with forward-thinking organizations to assess, amplify, and embed their desired social and environmental impact using the UN SDGs as a guiding framework. She serves as the partnerships and standards lead at the Common Approach to Impact Measurement and also serves as director of programming for Leading Change Canada. A dual citizen since birth of Canada and Trinidad and Tobago, she holds a Master in Environmental Studies and a BA in Economics and Social Science, both from the York University. I am delighted to welcome to the Climate Conscious Podcast, Miss Alicia Richins.
Hello. Good morning. How are you?
I'm great, thanks. How have you been?
I'm great. I'm so glad that I get to have this conversation with you. I'm glad that I'm physically in Trinidad right now to have this conversation and to, participate in some of the conversations and work and dialogue happening here in the Caribbean as well.
Yes, we share a passion for the SDGs, so I'm very excited for us to get into it. If you spent any time in and around the sustainability space, you must have heard the term SDGs, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which represent a universal call to action on environmental protection, peace, and prosperity. It was adopted by the United Nations in 2015, so it has been on the agenda for some time. But Alicia, what is the significance of these goals?
That's a great question. I think there's so many different points of significance. I think for one, thinking about how do we mobilize the global community around sustainable development, around, goals for poverty alleviation and peace and security. When in previous iterations of something like this, the closest thing is the Millennium Development Goals that ran from 2000 to 2015. And those were really focused on the global south. It was very much the global north coming together and saying, okay, we're rich and we know how to do this. So we're going to tell you global south how to do this. And there was a lot of great progress made from the Millennium Development Goals. But what's really great and significant about the SDGs is now that we have this, this much more global framework that really identifies work that we all have to do in every country, big and small and rich and poor. And no country in the world has achieved all 17 of the goals yet. So it really we're not on an even playing field, but we are on the same playing field. And it kind of, it creates that context of understanding how interconnected we are as people, as countries, as a society, as well as how interconnected our issues are, right? Like we have 17 goals. That's a lot. That's a lot to process and a lot to think about. But it really reflects not just the diversity of issues and interest areas across the planet, but just the way that all of our different challenges and issues, from the economic to the environmental to the social, are so interlinked and interconnected.
The more you get into sustainability, you realize how everything more or less intersects, and it's impossible and also very ineffective to function in silos. We need to really integrate the economic, social, and environmental aspects as we move forward.
Yeah.
But when I look at the SDG Index ranking of 165 countries, I notice that at least 7 Caribbean countries are not ranked. And for the Caribbean countries that were ranked, it ranged from a ranking of 49 out of 165 for Cuba to 150 out of 165 for Haiti. And in many cases, there were data gaps. So while this gives us an idea of the region's performance when benchmarked against this internationally accepted framework, is this a reliable tool for us to use? Is it appropriate for the unique situation of SIDS, Small Island Developing States?
That is such a great question and also excellent context, right? I think we have unique challenges in small island developing states in terms of our physical isolation, for lack of a better word, our separation from the rest of the world, our small size, our unique vulnerability to shocks and changes in the global context. And like you mentioned, data gaps. I think one of the biggest challenges, and it's not, and that challenge isn't specific to SIDS, but I think in the Caribbean, I feel it even more heavily than when I'm in Canada. Is just the lack of data, the lack of real solid data, not just from like a census perspective, but from understanding what's happening across all of these different spheres that we're trying to, really contextualize and progress and move forward on. I think in the Caribbean, we have a great opportunity to really expand our digital infrastructure, really start to digitize our archives and our systems so that we have better access to data to use and better knowledge of the context. I think also globally, that's kind of why I got into this work, consulting with organizations, because the SDGs are really focused at the national or federal level. And it's really hard for like the community level or the organization to tangibly figure out, okay, how do I have an impact here? And then because we have these data gap challenges, then regardless of what impact is happening at the community level or the organization level, like every nation has a challenge of, really understanding that properly because of the data gaps, individually and those data gaps that intersect with these different levels. I think the SDGs are definitely still relevant. I think we're only now starting to really dive into, okay, how do we apply this thing in the Caribbean and in small island developing states? I think there's definitely space to contextualize it to our unique situation. Particularly around, targets and indicators that make better sense than others for our context. But I do think that they still encapsulate all of the challenges that we have. We might just kind of focus on certain SDGs differently or more deeply than others.
What I like about the SDGs is that it encourages us to think globally, but also act locally. While the SDGs are universal, as you mentioned, they must be addressed at a national level, and then they can drill down to the community level. So as a sustainability and social impact consultant, you help organizations to embed the SDGs in their operations. How do we translate these universal priorities to a local context?
Yes. So yeah, that's really, like I mentioned, how I got started working in the nonprofit sector in Toronto. People would mention the SDGs in passing and it became like a funding priority across the board. But at the organization level, nobody really knew what the heck to do with it. Like, how do we actually like make this work for us? So in my work, I really start from the place of understanding what is the organization's own mission and objectives, and then how do we kind of find the areas of overlap with what the organization is already kind of committed and focused on doing with what the sustainable development goals are trying to get us to do. Sometimes it's really obvious. Sometimes it takes some time of like value chain mapping, stakeholder engagement to really find those opportunities. But when you do, it becomes so like almost like natural. It becomes so like common sense in a way. I think the challenge is that we don't really have, or at least we didn't for a long time, have really great like standards for how to apply it at the organization level. The UNDP literally just launched the SDG impact standards for enterprises and investors just last year. I got certified in their framework and how to measure impact against that framework. So there's a lot that's like now starting to happen, but there isn't a lot of like formalized process for how to do it. And so basically, I take like an impact measurement perspective. It wasn't my original intention when I started out. I really wanted to focus on strategy. So it's like how do we connect strategy and mission and objective with like how are we actually collecting data and measuring and creating evidence of the impact that we're making across the SDGs. And it's really, I think, about translating into this common global language, because we tend to operate in our different sectors in these kinds of silos with all sorts of different jargon that's specific to us. And I think one of the great values of the SDGs is this kind of global common language that regardless of your sector, regardless of your industry, regardless of your organization type or size, here is a common language that we can all mobilize around together as we, defend a bright and prosperous and just and ecologically sustainable future for us all.
Yes, I agree with you in terms of the value of having that common language and also the flexibility of making it yours. And I think that's where, as a region, we can advance our sustainable development vision and objectives by taking a closer look at what these goals really mean for us.
Absolutely. Like really deepening our understanding of the goals themselves, but also our understanding of what is it that we're trying to do in our enterprise or our nonprofit or community organization, and what are the issues that we really care about, and how do we connect the two things?
Well, as I mentioned, the goals have been around since 2015, and I think that initially we may have limited it to the policy level and as a national priority. But I love that it's being integrated into business operations. And I think that is where we have a real opportunity to see impact at the local level.
Absolutely. I think even one of the Undersecretary Generals of the UN had, she said this thing late last year at the COP26 that, when it comes to SDG implementation, it really happens at the local level. Like I think she said two-thirds of all of the targets and indicators that we're trying to achieve, we're not going to get there unless we're like working at the local level to achieve them.
Because I think one of the challenges in the region is that I don't think there's a shortage of policy, and especially if it's a universal mandate. We tend to go with the flow in terms of signing on to these international agreements, which is good. But how do we move from awareness or these agreements to action? We really need a bias for action because essentially our lives depend on it. So I think it's very important that all stakeholders understand their role and accept their role and make efforts to advance or take action.
Absolutely. I mean, I think to some extent, we definitely go with the flow. I think Trinidad was one of the latest signatories to the Paris Climate Agreement, which makes me, hesitate with our go with the flow mindset. I think we definitely have some structural challenges in terms of how our different economies are organized and what that means for a healthy, climate safe future. But yeah, we definitely need to be engaging all of us in this conversation, and all of us need to feel some buy-in to the goals and how they can apply to us in our personal lives and in our communities.
So Alicia, 17 goals. That's a big task. How do you approach it to avoid feeling overwhelmed or maybe facing analysis paralysis?
Oh, yes, analysis paralysis for sure. So like with my clients, typically we would start off and, I would say, before we even start to dive into mission and objectives, I would just say like, which of the SDGs do you think, apply closest to the work you're trying to do? And typically people would try to come up with maybe not all 17, but they would try to select like 10. And I mean, it's great long term to start thinking about, okay, how do we actually implement across all 17 goals? But I think when we're starting, it's really important to focus, like sometimes just focus on like 2 or 3, maybe 4. Get really good at articulating the language, get really good at, translating the targets and the indicators. But, the whole challenge with analysis paralysis, like we get so bogged down with, okay, like I need to have like all the indicators, and we need to have, some people want to come up with these repositories of hundreds of indicators. But like, are you actually going to be able to collect that data? All of the indicators require different points of data collection, and that's actually a lot of work to do on top of your core operations. So really thinking strategically about like, all right, let's maybe choose 3 or 4 indicators to start with. Let's get good at collecting data. Let's get good at analyzing data. Let's get good at even choosing the most relevant and useful indicators for our context. And then we can start to learn about how we kind of expand that work more broadly. I think there's analysis paralysis on one hand, and on the other hand, there's the challenge of like rainbow washing or purpose washing, where people are just like, okay, well, yeah, we have like mostly women on the team, so we do gender equality. And it's just like, actually, I think there's a bit more work that we have to do in here to say that, this organization is working to achieve gender equality at a higher scope, right? So it's like, how do our micro actions at the organizational level translate into change at the macro and international level? But yeah, I think it's really good to just start where you are and slowly start to build out from there. Just keeping an understanding is what I like to say of, how the work you do in one SDG might actually have some indirect impacts for other SDGs that we could start to keep an eye on, at least.
And you mentioned a very interesting concept of rainbow washing. My listeners may be familiar with greenwashing, which we've been seeing a lot of, recently with sustainability becoming one of the latest buzzwords. But rainbow washing, it's similar in terms of it's easy to slap on a title just to say that. I guess you jump on the sustainability bandwagon, but what we really need is meaningful effort. And then it comes back again to data that can verify whatever claim that you are making as an organization to demonstrate how you are achieving these goals or these objectives that you have set for your operations.
Absolutely. It takes more than a new tagline or, a new kind of conversation series in a corporation. It takes like actual tangible action to create change from what the status quo is. And so, yeah, we really need to make sure we're working toward meaningful change and not just kind of trying to slap another marketing logo or branding on our work.
So can you share any success stories of how the SDGs have added value?
Yeah, I mean, with some of my clients, there's one in particular based in the Greater Toronto area called Accelerate Her Future, that we did some work together because they had a really great framework of thinking through their impact and thinking through like, okay, what are the different areas of impact we care about and what are some of the indicators that we can start tracking? And so in the work that I did with them, it was really about mapping their individual indicators to the SDG indicators and maybe doing a bit of like massaging to make them fit a bit better. But really getting to the nitty gritty, I would say, of like, okay, how is the work that we're doing connected to this bigger piece? And I'm really keen to see how they continue to develop. I think in a more tangible example, anyone can go look up the SDG Good Practices Guide online. And I was looking for one that was specific to the Caribbean. And there was one, it's called the Local Carbon and Resource Efficient Action Plan for Accommodation in St. Lucia. So it's all about like, how do we get sustainable development imbued into like tourism practice in St. Lucia and a few other countries in the OECS region. And they were able to really start to think through, the transformation of their tourism value chain to improve resource efficiency and reduce emissions. That gets St. Lucia to increase competitiveness and resilience while meeting national and international commitments. And so they map out a couple different programs of action that they've been working on to start to get to that. I think, one of the challenges, like we mentioned before in the Caribbean context, is indicators and data. They're still working through, those SMART criteria, that your data has to be specific and measurable and actionable and whatnot. But I think it's really heartening to see how those transformations happen in terms of just thinking more holistically in the work that you're doing. Like, okay, we have tourism. Tourism is important to the sector. How do we get affordable and clean energy built into it? How do we reduce waste in our sector? How do we collect data? And I think, those are just some really great examples of how it helps you think more holistically about your impact and then actually create some tangible change for your organization and the community it serves.
The aim is to get tangible change. I think we've recognized that there's a need for change and we've discussed it at length coming out of the last COP. And before you know it, we'll be going into another COP. But more than ever, we need tangible change.
Yeah, I think it's a lot easier for social enterprises and community organizations and nonprofits that change is part and parcel of their cooperations. But for organizations that's kind of, you have a core business operation, it doesn't really have anything to do with changing the world. It's a bit harder and it moves a bit slower. But it's really about strategically embedding okay, what's the future that we're trying to build toward, and how can our organization be part of that future? And then, okay, what are the changes tangibly that we're going to have to make to get there?
Yeah, there's definitely a challenge, and maybe that is what makes this work exciting. Because for some organizations, it's quite obvious, and they already have a willingness to embrace sustainability and embrace the SDGs. But for other operations, where, as you said, their key function is not about saving the world. They may be hard pressed to understand why they should adopt this framework and how it will add value to their organization.
Yeah. I mean, one of the points I bring up all the time when I do workshops and presentations is just like you're getting ahead of regulation for those kinds of corporate or, bigger operations. As we see, we're living in this really dynamic world with a lot of things happening. I don't want to get too much into the latest IPCC report today, but there's a lot happening, and there's a lot of new information coming out every day, and there's a lot of change moving forward in our economies and in our societies. And so I think, starting to really think more deeply about the SDGs and core operations gets you ahead of the curve. So even if it's not like part of your core organization's operations, and maybe you don't really see, the tangible benefit to you right now, it makes it a lot easier for the future that everybody else is trying to build towards, and being a part of that and getting ahead of changes and regulations and the way that we operate businesses and organizations in the future.
So I might be putting you on the spot, Alicia, but do you have a favorite SDG?
Gosh, this is the hardest question that everybody loves to ask. I think I have a top two. So top two for me are climate action, goal 13. Not because it's more important than any of the others, but because it's like so much more urgent. And that's kind of like my driving motivation with all of this work, is just like, how are we going to, survive a future or create a future that is survivable, where we can all prosper, where we can all be healthy and happy and provided for in a sustainable manner. And my second favorite one is partnerships, because like I mentioned back at the beginning, like it's really about how are we doing this all together. Like nobody can achieve the SDGs on their own. It's all about us, all of us, doing our little part in our little way, and connecting those parts together and supporting each other, that we're going to really be able to get there. What about you? Do you have a favorite?
I have a top two like you. Definitely climate action. To me, that connects all of the other goals. For example, life on land, life below water, and of course, partnerships, because that's the only way we can really achieve our objectives in terms of climate action. Oh, and also like you, it really provides the basis for the work that I do and the mission of the Climate Conscious podcast, as the name implies. My second favorite would be clean energy. And it's there to me because, I've spent my entire career working in the energy sector in different incarnations, generally managing environmental impacts. So I've witnessed the ongoing transition that is moving us away from a reliance on fossil fuels towards sustainable energy, where fossil fuels may have a role, but definitely the emphasis would be on clean energy and ensuring that persons have access to clean and affordable energy. And again, that ties back directly to climate action. So
yeah, that's so great and so important, because even I think sometimes people think of like environmentalists and people in the sustainability space as trying to like reduce their quality of life. Like, oh gosh, they want us to go back to, the old ages, or like, living in caves. But I think energy is a really key part in like articulating that maintained standard of living, or at least quality standard of living, where we still get the energy that we need to do all of the great things that we've gotten so used to doing, while changing others.
Yes, and that's one thing about the sustainability movement, is that along the continuum, you have persons who might be considered tree huggers, or who may advocate for, let's say, 100% renewables. And then you can go down across the spectrum in terms of, I think the work that we do is about looking at how we can balance priorities. There are persons who would stand on different extremes. One extreme of the complete pursuit of profit above all else, and the other extreme of conserving or preserving the environment and not entertaining the thought of any form of impact, which I think is a
they're
bit
both wrong.
right. Yeah, they're both wrong, right? So
yeah, there's no such thing as like living on this planet and not creating impacts. It's about like making those impacts as, least or, minimizing the negative side of some of those impacts.
That is what makes our work so important and allows us to add value. As you mentioned, sustainable development is not about reducing the quality of life. It's about improving that quality of life, but in a manner that also maintains the integrity and the intrinsic value of our natural and social ecosystems. There's so much to be done, and I'm very excited about being in this space and seeing the progress that has been made and continues to be made, and also recognizing that there's a lot for us to do globally, but more specifically, there's a lot for us to do in our region to allow us to move forward, allow us to achieve a desired level of development that also caters to environmental and social as well as economic well-being for our communities.
Well said.
So as we close, what are your recommendations for more effective use and improved impact of the Sustainable Development Goals in the Caribbean?
That is a great, great question. Okay, let's see. Where do we start? I think first we need to understand the SDGs. Really take some time going through the UN's website. It's really great and interactive. It has lots of, really great annually updated infographics about how we're doing and, what exactly is it that we're trying to do with these goals. I think we need to balance a deepened understanding of the goals with what are we trying to do as organizations or as, Caribbean countries or small island developing states. And then really trying to map those against each other. I think in the Caribbean, we also need to work on our digitization, like get our records digitized, start, get better at collecting and sharing data. I think it's a really big gap that we are fully capable of addressing. I think it's really what's going to propel us forward in fully understanding what the context is, and understanding what it is that we can do to move forward. I think at the individual level, like I said, or the organization level, really start from basics of like, okay, what is our core mission and vision? What is it that our stakeholder base or our community cares most about, and then start to think about how can we really work to implement that. And I think more great conversations like this. I think we need to have way more dialogue, connecting people, connecting different initiatives and opportunities. I think we're starting to see more funding coming into the Caribbean for a lot of this work, and just really help to co-promote each other's work and support, and kind of build on those from a multi-solving perspective, right? Like so much of what we do in one area can impact other areas, and we just need to get better at collecting and sharing that data.
Absolutely. And I must thank you for joining me to engage in this discussion around the SDGs and helping us to get a deeper understanding of the relevance to us in the region and at whatever level, at the national level, at the level of an organization, and even at the community level. The SDG is so valuable in terms of offering us all a common language when we speak about creating sustainable and resilient societies. And the fact that the 17 goals are all interconnected, it really forces us to think holistically about impact, as you mentioned. And I just want to commend you on the work that you're doing in terms of helping to bridge the gap between the policies and creating tangible action, tangible change.
Absolutely. It's been my pleasure to chat with you. I'm also a big fan of all the work you do. And I think, like James Elsmore always says, islands in general have such a unique position as incubators for the future. We're really well positioned to kind of sit at the cutting edge and start to really test things out and teach the rest of the world how to do this thing. So we really just need to embrace that innovative mindset and take on a leadership role, which I think we're starting to see.
So Alicia, where can listeners connect with you?
Well, I am very easily accessed on LinkedIn. I also have a personal website, aliciarichins.com. And otherwise, I am always on Instagram and Twitter at Alicia Moena.
There you have it, folks. Connect with Alicia on LinkedIn, Instagram, and Twitter. And you can also connect with the Climate Conscious on those platforms at the Climate Conscious. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review. Thanks for tuning in.